In the last section, we talked about how international business helps Canadians. In this section, we look at how international business hurts Canadians. Let's just scroll ahead here and look at this image of a young girl, Canadian, and what she's wearing and carrying. She's wearing a baseball cap, hoodie, jeans, shoes, much like you probably would be wearing. And it's interesting to note that nothing that she's wearing or holding comes from Canada. The items that she has comes from many other countries. Italy, Vietnam, cell phone from Finland, a watch from Switzerland, her pen maybe from Taiwan, her socks from Pakistan, jeans from Mexico, etc. So take a look at what you're wearing, holding. Do any of the items you're wearing come from Canada? Because none of these items come from Canada, it's not beneficial to Canadian manufacturing, and that's just one of the ways that business hurts Canadians. The benefits of international business come at a cost to Canadians. No other nation has as large a foreign economic presence in its country as Canada has with the economic influence of the United States. American dominance of Canada's economy affects us economically and culturally. So, how does American dominance affect us culturally? If you watch American television shows, go see Hollywood movies, listen to musical artists from New York, play American video games, or read books by U.S. authors, you are a consumer of American culture as well as, or instead of, your own. It is very difficult to live in Canada and avoid American culture. Almost 90% of Canadians live less than 160 kilometers from the US-Canada border. The United States has a huge entertainment industry that produces big-budget movies and television programs and distributes them through theater chains or television networks and cable stations to Canadian consumers. It is difficult to assess the influence of American culture on Canadian identity. In some respects, many Canadians define themselves as not American. Perhaps easier to assess is the American influence on Canada's culture industry. The movie industry in Canada is a prime example. There are far fewer Canadian movies than American ones shown in Canadian theaters. American movies tell American stories that feature American culture. Canadians do not see a reflection of their history or identity on the screen. They watch American heroes, sports stars, politicians, soldiers, and cowboys, Wall Street power brokers, gangsters, and so on. The settings are the US cities, and the stars are Hollywood actors. It's difficult for Canadian filmmakers to raise enough money to produce the big budget blockbusters that attract large Canadian audiences. When Canadian filmmakers do manage to get a film made, it is difficult to get screen space in the major Canadian theatre chain Cineplex, as Canadian moviegoers want to see the well-promoted Hollywood movies, as do many other countries in the world. Canadian books, music, and television, however, are different from Canadian movies. Many Canadian book buyers are aware of Canadian authors because of the media attention given to the major prizes for Canadian literature, such as the Giller Prize, Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, and the Governor-General's Literary Awards. The coverage given to the nominees and the ultimate winner of these prizes draws media attention and spurs sales of Canadian books. The Canadian government supports Canadian publishers and authors through grants and other programs. The Canadian government recognizes the cultural importance of Canadian broadcasting and protects the Canadian radio and television industries. Here we touch on the idea of protectionism. Again, the Canadian Radio, Television and Communications Commission, CRTC, I'm sure you've heard of them, established a system of quotas to regulate the amount of Canadian program content broadcast in Canada. The resulting Canadian content rules, which came to be known as CanCon, were devised to stimulate Canada's cultural production by ensuring greater exposure for Canadian artists in the Canadian marketplace. director James Cameron. He's Canadian, and he's responsible for many famous films, Avatar, a whole bunch. He's received many awards. Excerpt from the Canadian Broadcasting Act. So this just talks about how we need to promote Canadian values, etc., ideals, artistic creativity, opinions, attitudes, and one of the ways to do that is by ensuring there's a certain quantity of Canadian content in our media. And that goes at the expense of other countries' culture. So some might argue that's not fair to other countries. Some might argue it's very fair. So I'm not sure what your opinion is on that. The Canadian music industry has been given quite a boost because of those rules. In most cases, 35% of all music aired on Canadian stations must have Canadian content. To qualify as such, it must conform to at least 2 out of the 4 conditions in the system, in the MAPL system: music, artist, production, lyrics. So 35% of what's played on Canadian stations must be Canadian in one of these ways. Canadian radio stations now look for Canadian groups or artists that have talent and give these artists lots of airplay to comply with the CanCon regulations, whereas in the past, musical acts with major American labels dominated the Canadian music scene. The Arcade Fire, Chaos, and Headley are Canadian musicians that owe a great deal to CanCon. So the argument might be that these groups may not have achieved the level of success that they have if it weren't for the forced play of Canadian music, Canadian art on Canadian stations. Okay, increased foreign ownership of Canadian companies. Even though foreign direct investment in Canada is now 30 times higher than it was in 1950, only 1% of the approximately 1.3 million corporations in Canada are foreign owned. This 1%, however, accounts for 30% of Canada's business revenues. This means that there may not be many foreign owned businesses in Canada, but the ones that are here, such as IKEA, McDonald's, are very large and very profitable. Every foreign company, however, is required to pay both federal and provincial taxes on their profits to the Canadian governments, and foreign-owned businesses provide jobs for Canadians. So, how does foreign ownership hurt Canada? So what are the disadvantages of having foreign-owned companies in Canada? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that we'll look at. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Foreign companies have foreign loyalties. That means their number one priority isn't looking after Canada, it's looking after their home country, their home base. Managers of foreign companies operating branch plants in Canada want to please the executives, investors at home, at their home. The first priority is their native country. If the Canadian branch plant shows less profit than the head office wants, it will be closed. General Motors, for example, closed its Windsor, Ontario transmission manufacturing plant as a cost-saving measure. If foreign suppliers can provide goods and services more cheaply than Canadian suppliers can, the foreign business has no reason to buy those goods and services in Canada. Instead, it will import and sell them in Canada. So it will move its operations, because it has it doesn't have any special connection to Canada. Lack of research and development. R&D is essential to the growth of a manufacturing firm and to the efficiency and increased profitability of a processing or service business. Well-educated managers, researchers, scientists, and technicians staff research facilities that are at the heart of the head office. New product development, the invention of new technology, The creation of new approaches to the marketplace, the improvement of efficiencies, and other innovations are expected from these facilities. Foreign-owned firms staff their R&D from their home country, and the ideas they produce lead to more jobs and greater profits domestically in their country, not in Canada. So because we have foreign-owned companies in Canada, the research and development doesn't necessarily benefit Canada. Reduced exports. One of the main purposes of foreign branch plants in Canada is to service the Canadian marketplace as a subsidiary of the parent company. Exports to other markets are usually not part of the subsidiary business plan. There is no reason for the branch plant to consider selling products to other nations, as that is the mandate of the parent firm. As a result, Canadian foreign-owned businesses do not enjoy the benefits associated with exporting, such as greater employment opportunities and bigger markets for Canadian goods. Revenues leave Canada to pay head office costs. The money earned by the branch plant in Canada helps pay the salaries of head office staff, including the executives. Administration costs of the business operations at head office level are also apportioned to the Canadian subsidiary. A portion of the revenue also subsidizes the advertising, accounting, and marketing expenses the head office incurs. This reduces the profit that the Canadian division realizes, and therefore the taxes that the business needs to pay the Canadian government. This also reduces the profit that the Canadian division earns, and therefore the taxes that the business needs to pay to the Canadian government. It also provides more employment for advertising agencies, accounting firms, and marketing departments within the home country. So the money earned in Canada does not stay in Canada. It goes to the home country to pay their expenses. And the last way that foreign ownership of companies in Canada hurts Canada or Canadians is economic destabilization. Canadians rely so heavily on foreign businesses that any major alteration in the global marketplace can adversely affect the Canadian economy. That means it can hurt the Canadian economy. A major recession in the United States, such as the one that began in late 2008, also creates a recession in Canada. Political decisions, such as the recent U.S. law passed to force businesses working on government contracts in the United States to buy American, can also negatively affect the Canadian economy, which relies on exports to the United States for a great deal of its revenue. These exports would be reduced significantly if the Buy American program expanded into the public sector. A program of this nature shows one way our reliance on our trade relationship with the United States is problematic. As former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, said when addressing the press club in Washington, D.C. on March 25, 1969, living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt. I'm sure you've heard the expression that when the Americans catch a cold, Canada catches pneumonia. That means slight changes that impact the American economy also impact the Canadian economy because we are so dependent on them as a trade partner. Swedish-owned home furnishing retailer IKEA's Canadian locations employ Canadian workers and generate provincial and federal taxes.